Hey folks, tonight's episode is going to be a little less about dusty scrolls and a lot more about dusty herbs. We're diving straight into the weird and wonderful world of medieval intoxication. Yes, they absolutely did it, and not just in the have a mug of ale and pass out under the tavern table way. I mean, they really got creative. Some of it's funny, some of it's kind of terrifying, but all of it incredibly human. Before we get started, do me a favor. If you enjoy deep dives into the strange corners of history, hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always amazed seeing how global this community has become. All right, now, dim those lights, grab a warm drink or a suspicious looking herbal tea, and let's get into it. Now, when you think of the Middle Ages, your mind might jump to plague carts, muddy roads, maybe a monk muttering in Latin somewhere. But take away the myths, and what you've got are people. Flawed, curious, sometimes reckless people. People who looked at weird mushrooms or roots and thought, you know what? Let's see what this does if I mix it with hot wine. And honestly, you can't really blame them. No electricity, no caffeine, no therapy. And the town's weekly entertainment was probably watching someone try to juggle turnips or dodging rats the size of chickens. So if someone told you that this particular flower could make you forget you owed half your harvest to a baron, you'd probably chew it too. Contrary to what modern movies suggest, medieval people weren't totally opposed to the idea of escaping reality for a little while. But it wasn't called getting high. No one was lurking behind a haystack passing around a pipe and whispering, "Bro, this hay is hitting." It was framed as medicine visions, divine revelation, or, just really bad judgment. Doctors used herbs. Monks cultivated them. Witches, depending on who you asked, used them in ointments. And most regular folks encountered them, whether in a healing potion, a church ritual, or by accidentally eating some very questionable bread. And let's be clear, this wasn't just about knocking back ale at the local tavern. Medieval intoxicants were wild. Roots that made your feet forget the floor. Flowers that made your soul feel like it was on fire. Seeds that took you on a dream quest with absolutely no warning. And ointments. Oh, they didn't just go on your arms. Sometimes these potions and brews were sacred. Sometimes they were recreational. And sometimes they were just plain accidents, like eating moldy rye bread and hallucinating that your sheep were plotting your murder. All you needed back then was a garden, a mortar, and pestle, and a general disregard for dosage. Nature was the medieval dealer, and she didn't come with instructions. Let's take henbane, for example. If medieval medicine had a roulette wheel, henbane was the ball. Prepared correctly, it could dull pain-ease sleep or make childbirth a little less traumatic. Prepared poorly, you might end up naked in a forest, telling a tree about your childhood trauma. Henbane, known to botanists as Hyoscyamus niger, was used everywhere from monasteries to battlefield clinics. Monks wrote about it. Peasants feared it. Witches loved it. In small doses, it was a sedative. In larger ones, you got delirium hallucinations and the sudden belief that the turnip in your kitchen was your long-lost grandfather. It contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, both chemicals that mess with your brain's neurotransmitters. In plain English, your reality gets weird. Like I'm having an argument with my own shoes weird. Some folks drank it in tea. Others smoked it. Some even turned it into ointment and rubbed it on their skin. One popular method involved mixing it with animal fat and smearing it on parts of the body that absorbed things very quickly. And yes, that's exactly where you're thinking. Now, was this legal? Technically, yes. The idea of controlled substances didn't exist yet, but the church wasn't exactly thrilled. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Still, henbane was popular. In fact, it even found its way into beer, before being banned in favor of hops, which are considerably less likely to make you think you can talk to geese. But if henbane was the wild party guest of the plant world, then mandrake was the dramatic one who brought a fog machine and whispered ancient secrets. Few plants were feared and revered as much as mandrake. Its root often looked vaguely human, stumpy arms and legs included, which really didn't help its already creepy reputation. According to legend, when you pulled a mandrake out of the ground, it screamed loudly, so loudly it could kill a man. To harvest it, people came up with some truly creative techniques. The most famous: tie the root to a dog walk away and let the poor animal do the pulling. The idea was that the dog would die from the scream instead of you. You got the mandrake. The dog got eternal pats in the afterlife, I guess. Once harvested, the root was dried, powdered, soaked in wine, or worn as a talisman. It was said to cause prophetic dreams, deep sleep, and in enough doses, unconsciousness or death. Some folks even carried tiny mandrakes in little pouches like magical AirPods to ward off evil or boost fertility, because nothing says romance like a mummified root that looks like it's seen some things. The church, unsurprisingly, was not thrilled. Mandrakes were considered borderline witchcraft, but monks still recorded its uses, sometimes in very suspicious detail. In medicine, it dulled pain-treated insomnia and made you feel like maybe, just maybe, your bowl of soup was whispering the secrets of the universe. And then there was belladonna, aka deadly nightshade. And yes, it's as dangerous as the name suggests. Belladonna got its name beautiful lady from its use in cosmetics. A few drops in the eyes would dilate the pupils, giving women a mysterious wide-eyed look. Think medieval mascara, but with a strong chance of hallucinations and death. The plant was also used as a painkiller sedative and, weirdly, as a kind of truth serum. Though the truths it produced were less, here's where the treasure is buried, and more the wall is whispering in Latin again. It contains atropine and scopolamine, potent compounds that mess with your nervous system. Symptoms: dry mouth, confusion, visual distortions, and the occasional passionate love letter to a candle. Belladonna was brewed into potions, turned into ointments, or used in rituals. One especially infamous use: flying ointment. A thick, trippy blend of belladonna, henbane, mandrake, pig fat, and a whole lot of questionable choices applied to mucous membranes. You get the picture. The goal: euphoria. The result: either a spiritual journey or waking up in a haystack with no pants and a strong suspicion that you kissed a goat. And that, my friends, is just the beginning. All right, welcome back. If you're still with me after the bit about hallucinogenic pig fat ointments, congratulations. You're clearly the kind of person who'd have survived the Middle Ages, or at least had a very interesting time at the village apothecary. So let's keep going deeper into the mossy rabbit hole of medieval intoxication. We've covered henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, but those weren't the only tools in the medieval high kit. No, sir. People were inventing their own versions of edibles long before anyone figured out how to make pot brownies. And unlike today's neatly labeled gummies or chocolate bars, medieval edibles came in forms like lard-based salves, bone broths with a suspicious aftertaste, or wines so spiced and thick they might as well have been soup. Take flying ointments, for example, the same ones we touched on earlier. These were probably the most notorious of all medieval concoctions. They were smeared not on the tongue, but directly onto the skin. Specifically, on mucous membranes, which are the fastest way to get something into the bloodstream without swallowing. We're talking about armpits, inner thighs, and yes, down there, This is where the image of the witch on the broomstick gets, well, complicated. See, some historical accounts written by very uncomfortable inquisitors describe women applying these ointments using long wooden staffs. Staffs that were, shall we say, strategically placed. And after applying the potion, many claimed to experience vivid hallucinations flying through the night, attending devilish feasts, shape-shifting, or simply hovering over villages like the world's creepiest drone. Now, were they actually flying? Of course not. But from their perspective, it felt real. And that was enough for authorities to declare it the work of demons. The irony: the church took these visions as literal truth, while the women experiencing them were just trying to manage a really intense chemical trip. The ingredients: a classic lineup henbane for hallucinations, mandrake for dreamlike states, belladonna for confusion, and often pig fat or butter to make it all stick. Sometimes hemlock joined the party because apparently belladonna wasn't dangerous enough on its own. The ointment wasn't just used for fun, it was spiritual. Mystics, folk healers, and yes, people accused of witchcraft used it in rituals meant to commune with spirits, explore hidden knowledge, or even escape their physical bodies. Which makes sense when you consider that life back then was rough. If your daily reality was full of back-breaking, labor-freezing nights and the occasional inquisitor knocking on your door, you'd probably be interested in something that made you feel like you could fly. And remember, these weren't substances you could just grab off a medieval Walgreens shelf. They were homemade, passed down through oral tradition, learned from experience and risk. It wasn't science, but it was a kind of chemistry, mixed with hope and a splash of chaos. Of course, not everything was rubbed onto skin. Some potions were consumed, usually in wine, beer, or broth. Medieval apothecaries loved mixing poppy extract, also known as opium, into mulled wine. Why? Because it dulled pain, helped you sleep, and might make you forget your leg was being amputated with a hot knife. Wine, especially spiced wine, was basically the medieval version of NyQuil. Got a cold, spiced wine. Achy joints, spiced wine. Existential dread from the feudal system crushing your soul. You guessed it, spiced wine. It was medicine and comfort, and maybe, just maybe, a ticket to a better mental state. Then there were the traveling salesmen of the day, the medieval equivalent of Instagram health influencers. These folks, known as quacks or charlatans, moved from town to town, selling elixirs that promised to cure everything from heartbreak to plague. Their recipes: a chaotic mix of real herbs, wine, maybe some chalk, and a dash of snake oil, sometimes literally. Did these elixirs work? Maybe, maybe not. But they often included strong intoxicants like opium cannabis or mandrake, which meant people did feel better because they were too high to care what was wrong. And that brings us to one of the most bizarre and unintentional ways medieval people got high ergot. Ever heard of it? It's a fungus that infects rye. And when you bake bread from that rye, well, welcome to the psychedelic dinner party you didn't mean to attend. Ergot poisoning, or ergotism, had two forms. The first caused convulsions, hallucinations, and wild dancing fits. The second cut off circulation to the limbs, leading to gangrene and even loss of fingers or toes. Entire villages could be affected. Bread was a staple, and if your harvest was damp or the grain stored poorly, it could be crawling with ergot. People would eat this cursed bread. Then days later, you'd see dancing plagues break out. Literal events where crowds danced uncontrollably for hours, sometimes even days. They thought it was divine punishment or demonic possession. In reality, it was probably just toxic toast. One particularly creepy example: the town of Strasbourg in 1518, where dozens of people danced until they collapsed. Some reportedly died. No one could stop it. and no one thought to check the bread. Historians still debate how widespread ergotism was. But one thing's clear: the line between nutrition and nightmare in the Middle Ages was paper thin. Now, let's talk about a natural high that wasn't entirely accidental mad honey. Yes, that's a real thing. Produced in certain regions, particularly around the Black Sea, by bees that fed on rhododendron flowers. These flowers contain gray entoxins, which, when concentrated in honey, produce some pretty intense effects. A spoonful could give you a light buzz, 2 hallucinations, vomiting, and a full-on spiritual crisis. It was used as medicine, sure, but also recreationally, and in one case, even as a weapon. According to ancient sources, a group of locals left out pots of mad honey for an invading army. The soldiers, thinking they'd stumbled on abandoned rations, helped themselves. Hours later, they were incapacitated, vomiting, hallucinating, crawling on the ground. Then the locals attacked. Mad honey, the original chemical warfare. It's still around today, by the way. You can buy it in parts of Turkey and Nepal. But even modern users are warned to dose carefully, because 1 spoon too many, and you're in for a wild, sweaty, regret-filled ride. So by now, you're probably wondering who was keeping track of all this. Who were the medieval equivalents of pharmacists, trip sitters, and wellness coaches? Enter the cunning folk. These were the semi-legitimate healers of medieval society, not priests, not doctors, but people who understood herbs rituals and folk magic. They weren't formally trained. Their knowledge was passed down through generations by mothers, grandmothers, midwives, and that one suspicious guy named Wolf who claimed he could speak to snakes. They knew which herbs calmed fevers, which ones eased childbirth, and which ones could knock you into a week-long dream about riding dragons with St. Francis. And they were everywhere, in small villages, hidden in woods, in the back corners of market stalls. They were your one-stop shop for everything from warts to visions. Many were women, wise women, midwives, healers, and because they operated outside official church or academic circles, they were also prime targets for accusations of witchcraft. Authorities feared them, not because they were brewing cauldrons of evil, but because they were effective and they didn't need Latin or a bishop's blessing to do it. If your baby was sick, if your crops were cursed, if your dreams were haunted, you didn't go to the castle. You went to the cunning woman down the lane who'd smear something on your forehead, mutter a chant, and hand you a vial of green liquid that might cure you or send you to talk to your dead uncle about rent money. And that brings us to one of the most important parts of this whole journey. So here we are, neck deep in salves, tinctures, questionable, honey and fungus-laced bread. And we've got to ask the real question. How did medieval people feel about all this? About the potions, the visions, the floating through the night with the devil experiences? Was it normal, sacred, heretical? Or just another part of surviving the brutal, muddy carousel that was medieval life? Well, it depends who you ask. If you were a peasant with a splitting headache, a toothache, or a baby on the way, you probably weren't too worried about whether your sleeping potion might also make you recite Bible verses backward. If it dulled the pain and didn't kill you, it was a success. If you were a monk or a mystic, you might view certain hallucinations as spiritual experiences, messages from God, signs of sainthood, divine intervention. Visions weren't always suspicious. They could be proof of grace. Just ask Hildegard of Bingen, a medieval nun and writer whose intensely vivid visions were recorded, admired, and even painted. Historians now believe she may have suffered from migraines or used herbal substances that enhanced her spiritual perception. But to her and her followers, it was divine truth. And then there was the church. Oh boy, the church had feelings about this. The medieval church's relationship with altered states was complicated. On one hand, they believed in miracles, in ecstatic visions, and saints hearing the voice of God. But that was supposed to come from prayer, fasting, and divine favor, not a mug of spiced wine laced with poppy resin. So anything that induced visions artificially, that was dangerous, suspicious, possibly demonic. And that meant people who used those substances, especially outside of church-sanctioned rituals, risked being branded as witches, heretics, or worse. Even if their only crime was making an ointment that made someone believe they could speak fluent Latin to a donkey. Still, context mattered. If a nobleman had a vision after drinking a strong herbal wine at a monastery, it was probably chalked up to spiritual insight. If a barefoot widow had the same experience in a forest hut surrounded by herbs and goats, well, it was probably time to light a torch and call the inquisitor. That's the hypocrisy of it. The church didn't ban substances outright. They used incense wine and even mild sedatives in religious ceremonies. Frankincense and myrrh, imported expensive and burned in clouds during Mass, have mild psychoactive properties. Studies today show that frankincense, when inhaled, affects areas of the brain related to emotion and memory. In other words, sitting in a smoke-filled medieval chapel for hours could genuinely alter your state of consciousness. Pair that with fasting and chanting, and you've got yourself a mild trip. But because it was religiously framed, it was acceptable. Holiness, not hallucination. Now let's zoom out to the common folk. For everyday, medieval people, using herbs and mind-altering substances wasn't about rebellion or religion. It was about survival, pain management, mental escape, getting through childbirth without dying from the agony, making it through the winter with something that numbed the ache in your joints, coping with grief when 3 out of your 5 children didn't make it to age 10. These substances were tools, sometimes misused, sometimes misunderstood, but often treated with respect. People didn't always know exactly why something worked. But when your grandmother's grandmother swore by a certain root or brew, you didn't argue with it. You just used it when the fever got too high or the screams got too loud. And that knowledge, it was passed on, word of mouth, worn pages in herbal manuscripts, hushed conversations behind market stalls. The medieval world didn't have modern science, but it did have pattern recognition. If enough people survived childbirth because of a particular herb, it became part of the community's toolkit, even if no one could spell alkaloid. But here's the catch: intent mattered. In the eyes of medieval law, using an herb to ease pain or cure an illness was fine. Using the same herb to curse your neighbor's goats. Now you were stepping into witch territory. You could be accused of sorcery for using the exact same plant, depending on how and why you used it. Let's say you're brewing a tea from poppy seeds to help your sick son sleep. Noble, normal, good parenting. Now imagine your neighbor's cows start dying and someone remembers you gave a stranger a strange-smelling bottle last week. Suddenly, that tea becomes evidence. Now you're not a mother, you're a witch. And because the line between healing and harming was so thin, many herbalists walked it with quiet caution. Too many miracles, you drew attention. Too many recoveries, people got suspicious. Too many dreams about flying. Yeah, definitely not a good sign in a religious town. But among the mystics, those dedicated to spiritual exploration, mind alteration wasn't feared, it was embraced. Monks fasted, meditated, and inhaled incense. Sufi dervishes in the Islamic world whirled themselves into ecstatic trances. Jewish Kabbalists sought visions through numerology and intense prayer. Buddhist monks practiced breath control and sensory deprivation. And yes, hashish. Let's talk about hashish, shall we? While Europe was busy smearing poison on broomsticks and passing out in haystacks, the Islamic Golden Age was approaching mind alteration from a much more, dare I say, civilized perspective. In regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant, hashish made from cannabis resin was widely known and used, but not just for recreation. For some mystics, especially among the Sufi orders, hashish was a tool for spiritual insight. It wasn't about partying, it was about dissolving the ego, achieving union with the divine, and pondering the meaning of existence. You know, casual Tuesday night stuff. Sufi poets, like Rumi, wrote about losing the self, finding God, and seeing the universe in a single breath. And while not all of them used hashish, it became associated with that search for transcendence. Consumed in honey balls, teas, or spice blends, it was the Middle East's more refined answer to belladonna and mead. Did everyone love it? Not quite. Islamic rulers tried banning it periodically, fearing it encouraged idleness or irreverence. But like every failed prohibition throughout history, those efforts were about as effective as throwing a rock at the moon. Hashish users didn't just get high. They wrote poems, crafted metaphors, painted mental landscapes, and they left behind a legacy of mindful exploration that still echoes in spiritual practices today. And this was happening centuries before Western medicine even began cataloging the effects of cannabinoids. Now let's come back to Europe, where the idea of herbal highs was more tangled in morality fear and occasional hysteria. If you were poor and sick, you hoped the local herbalist had something to ease your suffering. If you were rich and melancholic, you might hire a traveling healer to blend a special wine or ointment. And if you were neither rich nor discreet, you risked being accused of dancing with demons. But in reality, these substances were everywhere. They were in the beer. You drank the incense. You inhaled the ointments you used to treat infections, and the poppy syrup you gave your child when the fever wouldn't break. They weren't some fringe curiosity. They were part of life. And medieval people, far from being ignorant, understood that these substances had power. Real power. To heal, to hurt, to connect, to escape. They might not have had MRI scans or peer-reviewed journals, but they had experience, stories, caution, and just enough bravery to drink something that smelled like a swamp if someone swore it would help. Coming up next, the most iconic and misunderstood image in all of this, the broomstick. Why did medieval witches ride them? Where did that idea even come from? And what does it have to do with flying ointment? Spoiler everything. All right, time to get into one of the weirdest and most iconic chapters in the medieval mind-altering saga, the broomstick. Yes, that broomstick. The one witches are always riding through stormy skies in Halloween decorations, old paintings, and slightly too serious religious pamphlets. You've seen it. It's everywhere. But have you ever wondered, why a broom? Why not say a goat or a chariot or literally anything else? Well, buckle up, because the truth behind the flying broomstick is a mix of real chemistry, medieval paranoia, and some deeply uncomfortable application methods. Let's rewind a bit. Back in the late Middle Ages, there were these thick salves known as flying ointments. They were sticky, greasy potions made of things like henbane, belladonna, mandrake fat, usually pig or goose, and sometimes even hemlock. Now, if you've been following this series, you already know what these plants do. They mess with your perception of space-time, gravity, and what species you are. These ointments were transdermal, which is a fancy way of saying they were absorbed through the skin. And they were most effective when applied to mucous membranes, which absorb substances faster than, say, your forearm or ankle. Now guess which parts of the body have the most mucous membranes? Yep, exactly the parts you're thinking about. So, how did people apply these salves without, sticking their hands somewhere awkward? That's where the broomstick, or staff as some historical records politely called it, came into play. Certain inquisitor manuals from the 15th century describe women anointing a staff with the ointment and then riding it. The implication wasn't lost on anyone, even in an era when metaphors were thinly veiled. The broom became both the method of application and the metaphor for the experience. Because after rubbing this stuff onto highly absorbent areas, users often experience sensations of flying, floating, or traveling through space. Hallucinations, essentially. Some claim they attended night feasts, danced with devils, or soared over cities like bird women of doom. Others simply felt weightless, out of body, or euphoric. Did they really fly? Of course not, but in their minds they did. And that was enough for the church to lose its collective mind. Let's be real here. The image of a woman alone in the forest, rubbing a hallucinogenic ointment onto a wooden handle and then mounting it. Yeah, that was going to raise eyebrows in a society where bathing too often was suspicious. And it wasn't just the church. The image of the flying witch, wild-haired, disobedient, untethered, scared a lot of people. She was everything society didn't want women to be free, powerful, and not waiting around for a man to interpret scripture for her. So the flying broomstick became both a symbol of rebellion and a weapon of accusation. If you were caught with certain herbs, or with a suspicious salve, or even with an old broom stored a little too lovingly, you could be accused of witchcraft. Never mind that your ointment was for sore joints or birthing pains. If it made someone have vivid dreams or lose their grip on reality for a few hours, it was assumed you were using it to fly to a devil's feast. No trial, no nuance, just stakes, firewood, and fear. But let's zoom back in on the science for a second, because this part is too fascinating to skip. The main chemicals in flying ointments, scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine, are all classified as anticholinergics. They interfere with neurotransmitters in the brain that regulate memory, movement, and perception. In the right doses, they can cause sedation, vivid hallucinations, and a strong sense of being outside your own body. Modern medicine uses small, controlled doses of these compounds for things like motion sickness and anesthesia. But in medieval times, dosage was more art than science. And the art was basically rub some on and see if you still remember your name afterward. Now here's where it gets even weirder. The reports of flying weren't isolated. They were surprisingly consistent. Many witches under interrogation, or more often torture, reported that the ointment made them feel like they were soaring through the air, that they left their bodies, that they communed with spirits or animals. These weren't confessions pulled from thin air. They were descriptions of actual hallucinations. And as chilling as the witch trials were, they inadvertently preserved valuable records of these experiences, which means today's historians, toxicologists, and anthropologists can piece together a surprisingly detailed understanding of what those ointments actually did. But flying ointments weren't just for spiritual adventures or broomstick aerobics. They had other uses too. Some were used during religious or folk rituals. Others were applied during childbirth to ease pain and induce sleep. In some regions, they were used to simulate death, yes, actual faux death. In Italy and parts of Eastern Europe, there are recorded cases of people using these ointments to slip into a death-like state for hours or days. Why? Well, it depends. To escape creditors, to fake illness, or more dramatically, to avoid arranged marriages or criminal accusations. It wasn't foolproof, of course. Sometimes people just didn't wake up. But when it worked, it was like hitting a reset button on your life. Just add poison. Wait and hope your family doesn't bury you too quickly. And it wasn't just women using these ointments. Men used them too. healers, monks, alchemists, and travelers. But women were far more likely to be punished for it. Why? Because women's knowledge of herbs was feared. It existed outside male-dominated institutions like the church and university. It was domestic oral and deeply connected to female experience, childbirth, menstruation, fertility, healing. To those in power, that made it dangerous. Now, let's take a quick detour from brooms to another sensory experience, incense. Because not all medieval mind alteration came from ointments or teas. Sometimes it came from smoke, sweet swirling holy smoke. In churches across Europe and in temples across the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, incense played a key role in ritual. But it wasn't just about smell. Burning substances like frankincense and myrrh releases aromatic compounds that interact with the brain's limbic system. That's the part of your brain responsible for emotion, memory, and behavior. Modern studies have shown that incensol acetate found in frankincense has mild psychoactive effects, promoting calm, introspection, even mild euphoria. Now combine that with fasting, sleep deprivation, or the sheer emotional weight of a 5-hour religious ceremony in a poorly ventilated stone cathedral. And you've got a recipe for altered consciousness. People genuinely believed they were experiencing divine visions, and in some cases they were, just not for the reasons they thought. So what's the takeaway here? That the line between sacred experience and chemical reaction was a thin one. And medieval people, whether they knew it or not, were walking it all the time. They drank wine laced with poppy extract and talked to angels. They burned resin that softened the edges of reality and believed it was the voice of God. They rubbed poison on their thighs and thought they were flying through the stars. It wasn't recreational. It wasn't rebellious. It was life. And that's where things get beautifully strange. Coming up next, alcohol. The most common, the most celebrated, and arguably the most necessary substance in the medieval world. From monks to peasants, it fueled life, death, and everything in between. All right, friends. After broomsticks and brain-bending ointments, it's time we talk about the OG of medieval intoxicants. No roots, no barks, no broom handles, just a wooden mug, a thick brew, and a lot of yelling. We're talking about alcohol. If there was one thing medieval folks could count on, besides war-plagued taxes and possibly goats breaking into your house, it was a drink. Beer, ale, mead, wine, cider. Fermented drinks of all kinds were not just common, they were essential, not just to relax or party, but to survive. See, medieval water was not great, unless it came from a fresh spring. Water sources were often polluted thanks to livestock sewage and the general chaos of daily medieval life. Rivers were where you washed clothes, dumped waste, and sometimes disposed of bodies, so drinking straight water. Yeah, not a smart move. Enter small beer. A low-alcohol brew that was essentially medieval Gatorade. It was hydrating, mildly antiseptic, and had just enough alcohol to kill off some of the nastier microbes lurking in untreated water. And it was everywhere. Kids drank it. Monks drank it. Pregnant women drank it. If you had a pulse, you probably drank small beer from sunup to sundown. Now let's talk about brewing. You didn't need a tavern to brew alcohol in the Middle Ages. Most households, especially in Northern Europe, brewed their own beer or mead in small batches. The recipes weren't written down, so much as felt in the bones. A pinch of grain, a handful of herbs, a prayer to St. Arnold, and a whole lot of guesswork. And that's where things got weird. Because, unlike today's beer, which is controlled and consistent, medieval brews were unpredictable. Sometimes they were smooth. Sometimes they were thick and sour. Sometimes they knocked you on your back and made you believe you were a stag. There was no ABV label, just Edith in the back room stirring the cauldron and saying, "This one's strong, lads. Careful now." And then there were monks, the real MVPs of medieval brewing. Monasteries across Europe weren't just spiritual hubs. They were also science labs, breweries, and testing kitchens. Monks brewed beer, not only to sustain themselves, but to support their communities, travelers, and even the sick. Brewing beer was part of the Benedictine rule. It was considered work in service of God. And because monks had access to books, gardens, and time, they started refining the process. They perfected fermentation. They documented hops. They made strong ales for festivals and weaker ones for daily use. In short, monks made beer better, and they drank a lot of it. Monastic records show some monks were allotted several liters of beer per day, all in the name of devotion, of course. But beer and ale weren't the only players. Let's talk about mead, that sweet golden drink made from fermented honey. Mead had a mystical edge to it. It was associated with gods, heroes, and poetry, especially in Norse and Celtic traditions. In Viking lore, mead was the drink of warriors, poets, and the divine. The mead of poetry was said to grant wisdom and eloquence to those who drank it, assuming they didn't pass out first. Cider and fruit wines were also popular, especially in regions where grapes were hard to grow. And when grapes were available, oh, that was luxury. Wine was considered noble, refined, even sacred. It was used in Christian sacraments, traded between regions, and hoarded by the rich, like liquid gold. But wine wasn't just wine, it was often enhanced. Herbs, spices, resins, and even flowers were added to make it more potent, more flavorful, or more medicinal. Mulled wine wasn't a holiday gimmick, it was standard practice. Want to warm up? Throw in cinnamon cloves, maybe a little opium tincture if your apothecary was feeling generous. And yes, there were recipes, strange, poetic, and sometimes deeply alarming. One medieval cookbook suggests mixing wine with frankincense and dragon's blood. Don't worry, it's not literal dragon, it's a red resin from certain trees. But still, that's a pretty metal drink. So, what did alcohol do for the medieval person? More than you think. It was medicine. Spiced wine to settle the stomach, ale to cure melancholy, mead to invigorate a tired body. If it made you sweat, dream, or burp dramatically, it probably had a use. It was nutrition. Ale and beer provided calories, hydration, and even some vitamins. Not great ones, mind you, but better than dysentery. It was social glue. Taverns, inns, roadside alehouses, these were medieval therapy clinics. People gathered to mourn, celebrate, gossip, fight, flirt, and occasionally invent entirely new dance moves that no one wanted to see again. It was ritual, religious ceremonies, harvest festivals, weddings, funerals, baptisms. Almost every major life event had a drink to go with it, and it was escape. In a world where your average day involved plowing, birthing, butchering, praying, and dodging fleas, a mug of strong mead at the end of the day was not just a luxury, it was a lifeline. Of course, there were downsides. People drank a lot. Public drunkenness was common. Fights broke out. Mistakes were made. And when alcohol was combined with things like poppy extract or strong herbs, you got some truly chaotic energy. There are records of medieval court cases where someone mistook a goose for a demon or tried to marry a tree while under the influence. These weren't just stories, they were real events logged by increasingly frustrated town clerks. And let's not forget alewives, the women who dominated brewing before it became commercial. For centuries, brewing was women's work. Housewives brewed ale for the family and sold extra to neighbors. They wore tall hats to stand out in the market-stirred cauldrons and worked with herbs and yeast. Sound familiar? Yup. That imagery helped fuel the witch stereotype. Cauldrons, hats, herbs, these were just tools of the trade. But when the brewing industry became more profitable and men wanted and women were pushed out, accused of making unclean beer, and in some cases, labeled witches. So once again, we see how substances and the people who handled them became targets, not because they were dangerous, but because they held power. Alcohol was everywhere. It was basic, it was essential, and it was sacred. The church might frown at flying ointments, but wine was divine. Jesus turned water into it. Priests drank it during Mass. Monks brewed it for the soul. And peasants gulped it down like holy Gatorade. It connected people across class, gender, and geography. Rich nobles sipped golden vintages from goblets. Poor farmers drank cloudy ale from cracked mugs. But they were all drinking, all finding small ways to blur the edges of their daily reality. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for something deeper, a culture of intoxication that was communal, pragmatic, and full of ritual. Because in the Middle Ages, drinking wasn't about forgetting. It was about coping, celebrating, mourning, enduring, surviving, and sometimes, yes, dancing in the mud until the chickens looked worried. Next up, how people got high on toast and didn't even know it. Yep, we're diving deeper into the madness of ergot, the mind-altering fungus that snuck into your bread and turned a breakfast into a supernatural horror show. All right, now that we've walked through the beer halls and monastery cellars of medieval Europe, it's time to explore one of the strangest, most disturbing, and completely unintentional trips of the Middle Ages. Say hello to ergot, the microscopic menace that turned humble loaves of rye bread into tickets to a terrifying psychedelic wonderland. If that sounds ridiculous, hold on to your tankards because this was real. It was deadly. And in some cases, it was mistaken for everything from witchcraft to demonic possession to divine punishment. Let's break it down. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that infects rye and other cereal grains. When it grows, it creates these dark, hard kernels called sclerotia, which can easily blend in with the healthy grain, especially if you're harvesting during a damp cold season and don't have access to a microscope, a science lab, or frankly, clean socks. And when you grind that contaminated grain into flour, you bake the fungus right into your daily bread. Now, to your average medieval peasant, this was just a slightly weird-looking loaf. Maybe a little chewy, maybe a little spicy in the wrong way. But food was food, and you didn't question it. You ate what you had. The problem, ergot contains alkaloids, like ergotamine, which interact with the brain and nervous system. These compounds can cause symptoms that range from mildly unsettling to full-blown horror movie material. There are two types of ergotism, or ergot poisoning, and neither of them is something you want showing up at dinner. First, you've got convulsive ergotism. This one's the trippy version. Victims experience muscle spasms, seizures, intense itching, vertigo, nausea, hallucinations, and the delightful sensation that their limbs weren't where they were supposed to be. People laughed uncontrollably, danced uncontrollably, screamed uncontrollably. Some started babbling in strange languages. Others thought they were animals, or prophets, or fire. The second type is gangrenous ergotism, which is way more medieval in the worst possible way. Here, the alkaloids constrict blood vessels, cutting off circulation. Fingers, toes, arms, and legs go numb, turn black, and eventually fall off. Imagine having your breakfast and then noticing later that your left hand is no longer responding to commands. And the worst part, people didn't know what was causing it. They blamed demons, witches, bad air, moral decay, you name it. But no one thought to point at the rye loaf. Let's talk about outbreaks. One of the most famous and disturbing cases of mass ergot poisoning occurred in France in a town called Pont-Saint-Esprit. Though that one was more modern 20th century, it mirrored symptoms documented throughout medieval Europe. People danced in the streets, saw terrifying visions, threw themselves out windows. One man reportedly believed he was a snake and slithered through the town before collapsing. Another tried to swim through his bed. It was chaos. And back in the medieval era, similar symptoms were recorded across Germany, France, and the Low Countries. Entire villages were affected. People convulsed in the streets. Others collapsed in fields. Some claimed to see angels. Others swore they saw devils chasing them through the corn. In many cases, local authorities or clergy labeled it divine punishment. Maybe the town had sinned. Maybe the local bishop needed a reminder to tithe more generously. No one considered that maybe the bread was just laced with a fungus from hell. And then there was the infamous phenomenon known as the dancing plague. Sounds fun, right? Spoiler, it wasn't. In 1518, in Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea reportedly began dancing in the street for no clear reason. She kept going for hours, then days, then more people joined. Within a week, dozens were dancing uncontrollably, many collapsing from exhaustion, and some reportedly died. No music, no joy, just frantic involuntary movement and absolute confusion. Some historians believe it was mass hysteria. Others point to ergot-contaminated bread as the trigger. Either way, it became part of the strange legacy of medieval Europe, where mental health, food safety, and supernatural belief collided in the most surreal ways. And here's where it gets really wild. Some scholars have suggested that ergotism may have played a role in the Salem witch trials. Stay with me. The theory goes like this: Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Strange behavior among young girls. Convulsions, hallucinations, paranoia, fits of screaming. All in a region where rye was grown and bread was a staple. The girls' symptoms bear a suspicious resemblance to convulsive ergotism. The argument is that maybe, just maybe, contaminated grain triggered symptoms, and the Puritan leaders, primed to see Satan behind every misstep, interpreted those symptoms as witchcraft. Is the theory proven? No. Is it possible? Absolutely. Because once again, the line between possessed by a demon and ate the wrong toast was razor thin. But here's what's truly tragic. People suffering from ergot poisoning were often punished instead of helped. They were whipped, exorcised, imprisoned, or shunned. Villages with outbreaks were avoided, shamed, or labeled cursed. And no one realized that the bread they relied on for life was occasionally killing them from the inside out. And this went on for centuries. So how did people eventually figure it out? Mostly through trial and error. Some monasteries and hospitals, especially those run by the Order of St. Anthony, began to make the connection, sort of. They didn't know it was a fungus, but they noticed that patients recovered when fed wheat instead of rye. The order even earned the nickname the Fire Healers, since they treated victims of what was sometimes called St. Anthony's fire, a term used for the burning sensation associated with gangrenous ergotism. Over time, awareness grew. Baking techniques improved. Grains were inspected more carefully, and the terrifying outbreaks slowly dwindled. But the legacy remains. Ergot wasn't just a footnote in agricultural history. It's a reminder that nature is weird, powerful, and sometimes deeply indifferent to human plans. One bite of bread could send you to a spiritual high, a medical emergency, or a nightmarish vision where your cat is singing in Latin and the floor feels like it's melting. And the worst part, you never even meant to get high. That's what makes ergot unique among medieval intoxicants. It wasn't smoked. It wasn't brewed. It wasn't rubbed on a broomstick. It was accidental, which makes its impact even more terrifying. Now you might be wondering, what about the rest of the world? Were Europeans the only ones experimenting with fungi, herbs, and honey that made you question your entire life? Not even close. In our next chapter, we're heading to the Black Sea, where even the bees got involved. That's right. We're talking about mad honey, the golden nectar that buzzed its way into warfare healing rituals and hallucinations that could drop an army where it stood. Okay, we've covered poisonous bread, drunken monks, and hallucinations induced by flying ointments. But what if I told you there was a kind of honey? Yes, honey that could knock a man flat, summon visions, and even win a war. Welcome to the strange and sticky world of mad honey. This wasn't your average grocery store honey, folks. No little teddy bear bottle, no toast involved. We're talking about a naturally psychedelic honey produced in specific mountainous regions, particularly around the Black Sea in what's now Turkey, Nepal, and parts of the Caucasus. The culprit rhododendron flowers, these bright, cheerful-looking blooms, contain something a little sinister, gray entoxins. Harmless to the bees, but very not harmless to humans. When bees gather nectar from these flowers, the resulting honey becomes infused with those toxins, creating what's now known as mad honey. Consume a little. You might feel lightheaded, some dizziness, a little warmth, maybe even a dream or two that feels suspiciously divine. Consume a lot. Well, you might vomit, hallucinate, pass out, see your ancestors dancing, forget your name, and collapse into a blissful but deeply concerning coma-like state. And here's the kicker. They knew this. Local communities were fully aware that this honey wasn't like the regular stuff. They used it intentionally in small amounts for medicine, religious rituals, and sometimes, yes, for fun. Need to treat high blood pressure. Mad honey. Need to induce a trance, mad honey. Need to relax your body and open your third eye while sitting cross-legged on a mountain ledge. You guessed it, mad honey. But it didn't stop with healing. Let's talk warfare. One of the most mind-blowing historical accounts of mad honey comes from the 1st century BCE courtesy of the Greek historian Strabo. He wrote about how local tribes in Pontus, modern-day northeastern Turkey, used this psychoactive honey as a weapon. Here's the story. Roman troops were marching through the region during one of their many campaigns of expansion. The locals, outnumbered and outmatched, needed an edge, so they turned to their environment. They left behind jars of mad honey in strategic locations, abandoned homes, resting spots anywhere. Roman soldiers might stop and think, hey, free snacks, and sure enough, the troops found the honey, thought it was a lucky break, and helped themselves. What followed was straight out of a nightmare. Within hours, the soldiers began vomiting, collapsing, writhing on the ground, overwhelmed by nausea and hallucinations. Some saw visions. Others just lost all ability to stand. And that's when the local warriors attacked, wiping out a Roman unit that should have steamrolled them. All thanks to a few jars of weaponized honey. That, my friends, is what you call organic warfare. And it wasn't a one-time thing. Greek historians like Xenophon also wrote about similar experiences centuries earlier. In his Anabasis, Xenophon describes how his soldiers consumed local honey while marching through the mountains and were soon overcome with dizziness, disorientation, and vomiting. They didn't die, but they were incapacitated for days. All because they wandered into a bad beehive zone. But here's where it gets interesting. Mad honey wasn't just a local hazard or a tool of war. It was also a trade good. Yep! People packaged it up, usually in small ceramic jars, and sold it intentionally. Sometimes as medicine, sometimes as a kind of exotic delicacy, and very rarely with anything close to a dosage label. The attitude back then was basically, here's some powerful honey, enjoy, and maybe don't operate any carts afterward. But for many, mad honey was more than just a drug. It was spiritual. Some practitioners, particularly in the mystic and folk healing traditions of the Caucasus and Himalayan regions used it to induce altered states. These experiences were thought to bring prophetic dreams, cleanse the spirit, or allow the soul to travel outside the body. It wasn't always pleasant. Grayonotoxins aren't exactly gentle, but it was revered, carefully prepared, carefully dosed, passed down through generations like a sacred remedy that buzzed in both the body and the mind. Still, results varied wildly. Some users claimed enlightenment, others claimed to meet long-dead relatives, and some woke up in a potato field clutching a root they believed was their reincarnated uncle. Either way, it worked. Just maybe not in the way anyone expected. And yes, it's still around today. You could actually buy mad honey in parts of Turkey and Nepal, especially in areas like the Black Sea Mountains and the Annapurna region. Local vendors will warn you to take it seriously. It's sold in tiny jars with warnings that read less like labels and more like challenges. In small doses, it can produce a relaxing, slightly euphoric sensation. In large doses, the hospital. And you're not just tripping. You're dealing with dangerously low blood pressure, slowed heart rate, and dizziness that feels like the earth turned sideways. Modern tourists occasionally end up in emergency rooms because they thought it would be fun to try a spoonful of the legendary stuff. Spoiler, it's not maple syrup. And your body knows it instantly. So why does this matter? Because it's a reminder that natural substances have always played a role in how humans navigate pain, meaning spirituality, and even warfare. And sometimes, those substances come from unexpected places. It's not just the apothecaries, the witches, the monks. Sometimes, it's the bees, buzzing through fields of rhododendron, unknowingly crafting a product so potent it could heal, enlighten, or incapacitate an army. And in the grand scheme of medieval intoxicants, mad honey is one of the few that perfectly encapsulates the era's accidental genius, that blend of survival instinct, folk wisdom, and a deep willingness to experiment with whatever the world offered. Coming up next, we turn the spotlight on the people behind all these potions, salves, and strange rituals. The cunning folk, the herbalists, the shamans, and the midwives, those who lived in the shadows but knew more about the body and mind than any royal physician ever would. They were healers. They were feared, and they knew exactly how much mandrake to mix with wine to make you think you were speaking with the dead. So far, we've talked about the herbs, the potions, the honey, and the hallucinogenic toast. But who exactly was behind all of this? Who was doing the grinding, mixing, steeping, smearing, and whispering? Enter the cunning folk, the unsung experts of the medieval world. They weren't priests. They weren't officially trained physicians. They weren't part of any university or noble court. But they knew more about natural healing and altered states of consciousness than anyone with a fancy title. And for centuries, these people, often women, were the go-to figures for everything from treating infections to summoning visions. Let's paint the picture. Imagine a crooked wooden house at the edge of the village. Herbs hang from the rafters. Bottles line the shelves. There's a fire always burning low, a few animal bones by the door, and a cat that's been alive suspiciously long. This is where you'd find her. Maybe she's called a wise woman, or a hearth witch, or just Granny Myrna, and she has a cure for whatever's ailing you. Your child has a fever. She's got a poultice. Your husband's got a bad back. She's got a salve. You're not sleeping. There's a tea. You're seeing ghosts in the chicken coop. All right, that one needs a stronger brew. These cunning folk were part doctor, part therapist, part spiritual advisor. They combined herbal medicine, folk magic, and ancestral knowledge passed down orally. No books, no charts. Just a lifetime of observing the land, the plants, the moon, the seasons, and the people. And most of the time, they were women. Not always, mind you. There were hedge wizards, traveling bone setters, and wandering herbalists who were men. But overwhelmingly, this was a woman's domain. Why? Because women controlled the hearth, the birthbed, the kitchen, and often the grave. They understood the rhythms of the body in ways male doctors couldn't because they lived those rhythms. They knew which herbs helped ease childbirth, which teas broke a fever, which roots brought vivid dreams, and which combinations might cause someone to see a glowing rabbit that spoke in riddles. But let's not romanticize too hard. These people weren't always viewed kindly. In fact, the cunning folk walked a razor's edge between beloved healer and suspected witch. If your cures worked too well, people got nervous. If your potions were a little too effective, people whispered. And if a neighbor's cow died after an argument with you, well, suddenly, your name was being carved onto a piece of wood with the word witch not far behind. Still, communities relied on them because the town physician, if there even was one, usually worked for the Lord, not the peasants. And those monks in the monastery, they might have books, but they weren't always going to help your screaming toddler at midnight. The cunning folk were available, and they weren't expensive. They didn't just deal in healing either. They handled the spiritual side of life, things the church wouldn't touch. Want to know if your late husband is at peace? They'd perform a rite. Think your house is cursed. They'd burn herbs and chant protection verses. Need help with fertility? They'd draw symbols on your belly and give you seeds soaked in moon water. Was any of this scientific? Not in the modern sense, but it was powerful and deeply rooted in experience. Their tools, whatever was on hand: henbane mandrake, poppy nightshade, yarrow, mugwort, elderberry, valerian, angelica. These plants weren't just medicine, they were knowledge. Each one had stories. Each one had risks. And the best healers knew how to balance them like a medieval symphony of chemistry and prayer. Let's talk recipes. You'd be amazed at what some of these folk could put together. A sleep tonic might include ground poppy seed, warm goat's milk, honey, a few drops of spiced wine, whispered blessings in Old English or Latin. Want to summon a vision? You might get mugwort tea steeped under a full moon, a small piece of dried mandrake root, frankincense smoke, and a charm made of twisted twine and ash. It wasn't about exact measurements. It was about intuition, about watching your patient's breath, their skin, the color of their eyes, their pulse, their dreams. This was holistic medicine before the word ever existed. And yes, sometimes things went wrong, a dose too strong, a tea left to steep too long, a poultice that burned instead of soothed. And when that happened, who took the blame? The healer, not the patient who begged for something stronger, not the weather that spoiled the herbs. It was the cunning woman, the witch, the crone, and the church. Oh, the church was always watching, because as much as these folk were feared by commoners, they were really feared by the clergy. Why? Because they worked outside the system. They didn't answer to bishops. They didn't speak Latin. They didn't pay tithes. And they were often more effective than the town priest at healing bodies and minds. Plus, they represented a different kind of power. The church taught that wisdom came from Scripture, from hierarchy, from above. The cunning folk believed that wisdom came from below, from the soil, the roots, the bones of your ancestors. And that scared people. When the witch hunts began first in scattered trials, then in full-blown purges, these were often the first people to be targeted, not because they were evil, but because they were knowledgeable, independent, and female. Still, they persisted, through whispers, through warnings, through word of mouth. Their knowledge lived on in the shadows, in the margins of books, in hidden scrolls, in grandmothers' gardens. And today, much of what we know about medieval herbalism comes not from royal records, but from the scraps these people left behind. A folded piece of paper in a shoe, a dried flower tucked into a wall, a charm stitched into a hem. They were the original pharmacists, mental health workers, and trip sitters. And though their names have mostly been lost, their influence lives on in every cup of herbal tea, every essential oil shop, every indie apothecary that sells mugwort under soft lighting and plays lofi beats. Coming up next, we answer the big question. How did medieval people actually feel about all this? Did they even realize they were getting high? Were they scared, comforted, or just doing what they had to survive in a world full of pain, spirits, superstition, and cold stone walls? Let's wrap it all together. So here's the million-crown question. Did medieval people know they were getting high? The answer is, kind of. Let's be clear. Your average 14th century peasant wasn't walking around saying, "That henbane tea hit harder than expected, huh?" They didn't have the language or science we use today. No serotonin receptors, no neurotransmitter diagrams, no TED Talks on psychedelics. But did they understand altered states? Absolutely. They just saw them through different lenses: spiritual, religious, magical, or even supernatural. To them, a vision wasn't a side effect. It was a message. A strange dream wasn't just weird sleep. It was a sign. And if you started laughing uncontrollably in the middle of a fast while feeling like your body was floating above a wheat field, that wasn't a neurological hiccup. That was divine contact. Or maybe demonic, depending on how it ended. They didn't need to name the compounds to feel their power. They lived it. They feared it. They respected it. Let's take a closer look at how these experiences were framed. 1. Religious ecstasy. One of the most common ways medieval people explained mind-altering experiences was through religion. If you fell into a trance, collapsed mid-prayer, or started muttering visions in Latin, you didn't know you spoke congrats. You were now a saint, or at least on your way to canonization. Monks, nuns, and mystics regularly reported visions after fasting self-flagellation, long hours of prayer, or consuming strange mixtures that were supposedly blessed, but might have just been moldy. Their hallucinations became relics. Their diaries became scripture, and their fever dreams became pilgrimages for others. Case in point, Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess composer and visionary. She had vivid, colorful visions she believed were divine messages. Scholars today debate whether those were migraines, epilepsy, or mild psychedelic experiences, but Hildegard called them the living light, and she painted them, and they are wild. She wasn't alone. Entire movements of medieval mysticism were built around altered states. You weren't just allowed to feel disconnected from reality. You were encouraged to, as long as it brought you closer to God. 2. Demonic possession. Now flip that script. Same symptoms, trance-shaking visions, odd behavior. But now, you're not in a monastery. You're a peasant woman in a cold village with no family backing you. Well, now it's not divine. It's Satan. If you screamed nonsense, writhed on the ground, or claimed to see shadows that weren't there, chances were good someone would suggest you were possessed, or a witch, or both, especially if it was harvest season and the local priest had run out of patience. Sometimes people really believed they were cursed. Other times, they were just reacting to contaminated grain mushrooms or a potent herbal remedy their grandmother swore by. Either way, the church took it seriously. They'd perform exorcisms, isolate the afflicted, or in worse cases, put them on trial. It wasn't about understanding the chemical cause. It was about control. If you couldn't explain the behavior, you had to blame it. 3. Healing and magic. Now zoom out from the church and into the village commons. If you had a fever dream after drinking a cup of mugwort tea from the local healer, you didn't question the effects, you expected them. The experience was part of the cure. Seeing spirits. That meant the sickness was leaving your body. Feeling numb. That was the pain breaking. The idea of a trip as separate from treatment didn't exist. The altered state was the medicine. It let you speak with your ancestors, understand your grief, or simply feel different in a world where most days felt painfully the same. And remember, most people didn't live long. They suffered from constant pain, disease, injury, or loss. These moments of altered perception weren't luxuries. They were relief. They were necessary. 4. Fear and suspicion. Still, that didn't mean everyone was chill about it. Many were afraid of altered states, especially those they didn't choose. A child collapsing in seizures. That could mean bad spirits. A woman who danced for hours without stopping. That could mean witchcraft. A man who claimed he saw heaven during a near drowning. That could mean he wasn't telling the truth about drowning. Without science, fear often filled the gaps. And when fear met ignorance, that's when the trouble started. Healers became witches. Sick people became heretics. Accidents became evidence. This is what makes the medieval mindset so fascinating. People didn't divide the world into natural and supernatural the way we do. There was no line. Everything was spiritual. Everything had meaning. So when they got high, even unintentionally, they didn't say that's just the chemicals. They said that was a sign, or a warning, or a blessing, or a curse. And that mindset shaped their reactions. Some leaned into the experience. They fasted, chanted, anointed, drank, and smoked to induce altered states. Others recoiled, trying to banish the sensations with holy water, salt circles, or confinement. But either way, they didn't deny that something real was happening. They may not have known the term psychoactive compound, but they absolutely knew how to change their consciousness. And now, centuries later, we're finally catching up. Modern science is rediscovering what medieval people lived, that the brain is sensitive, perception is fluid, and nature has ways of shifting reality if you're bold or desperate enough to explore it. The big difference, we now measure our doses in milligrams. They measured theirs in hope intuition and a whole lot of trial and error. Next up, the final chapter. Let's pull it all together and answer the real question. What does this bizarre, beautiful world of medieval mind-altering substance use teach us today? Why does it matter? And what does it reveal about the timeless human hunger to feel something more? So here we are. We've wandered through the smoky apothecaries, danced with plague-stricken peasants, chewed on mind-bending bread, and sipped honey that could bring down an empire. But now, it's time to ask, why does any of this matter? Why care about how people got high in the Middle Ages? The answer is simple. Because understanding how they coped with reality helps us understand how we do. Let's face it, life in the Middle Ages was brutal. Disease, war, hunger, religious pressure, superstition, inequality, and death, always just around the corner. In a world like that, the urge to escape, to alter perception, to seek relief wasn't weakness. It was survival. And though we dress it differently today, with lab coats, prescriptions, therapy apps, and TikTok hashtags, the core desire is exactly the same. We want to feel better. Whether that means numbing pain, chasing meaning, confronting grief, or just seeing the world a little differently for a while. We're not so different from that peasant sipping small beer or that monk burning frankincense in a candlelit cell. 1. Substances were tools, not just escapes. In the modern world, the word drug can carry a lot of baggage. It implies abuse, addiction, danger, or illegality. But to medieval people, they're versions of drugs. Plants, brews, ointments, smokes were tools. Tools for healing. Tools for understanding, tools for connection. They didn't draw hard lines between medicine and magic, between mind and body. They used what they had, and they weren't always wrong. Modern science has proven that many of the herbs they used actually work. Valerian really can calm you. Poppy really does dull pain. Henbane and mandrake. Dangerous, yes, but psychoactive, absolutely. Even ergot in the right hands gave rise to LSD centuries later. They didn't have microscopes, but they had experience. They paid attention. They listened to the land, too. The power was local. Another lesson. The power was often in the hands of ordinary people, cunning folk, midwives, monks, mothers, grandfathers who grew their own herbs, farmers who brewed their own beer. In a time when centralized medical knowledge was rare and expensive, folk wisdom filled the gap. It wasn't always safe. It wasn't always accurate, but it was something. And it gave people autonomy. Even today, we see a return to that mindset. Herbal teas, DIY tinctures, mushroom-based therapies, microdosing, breathwork, psychedelic therapy. It's all part of a cycle, coming back to the roots quite literally. We're rediscovering what they never truly forgot. Nature changes you. And sometimes, that's exactly what you need. 3. Intoxication was communal. Today, altered states can feel isolating. People trip alone, scroll alone, sleep alone, cry alone. But in the Middle Ages, these experiences were often shared. You drank in a tavern. You healed at the hearth. You fasted with the monastery. You danced in the fields with your neighbors when the bread hit a little too hard. Altered states weren't just tolerated, they were woven into community life. And maybe that's the part we need to relearn most. That seeking meaning relief, or just a moment of escape, doesn't have to be a solitary thing. It can be something we do together, safely, respectfully, wisely. Not every medieval ritual was good. Not every potion was safe. But the instinct behind them, that was profoundly human. 4. Perception was sacred. When people had visions, dreams, hallucinations, they didn't immediately dismiss them. They asked questions. They paid attention. They saw them as portals, not problems. Of course, that could go wrong, leading to witch hunts, fear, or punishment. But it also led to art music, spiritual awakenings, and communal healing. They accepted that not all reality was material, that some truths lived in the fog between waking and dreaming, between what you touched and what you felt, between the body and the soul. That's something we forget today in our hyper-productive, hyper-rational, hyper-scheduled lives. But the medieval world didn't forget, and maybe, just maybe, they were onto something. 5. The same hunger lives in us. The real takeaway from our long trip through medieval highs, that this strange, dark, unpredictable world was full of people who wanted what we all want: relief, connection, understanding, comfort, mystery, power. A moment to breathe, a moment to forget, a moment to see what might be beyond the veil of the ordinary. They were curious, they were desperate, they were brave, and they were human. And now, in a world full of lights and screens and streaming content and synthetic pills and lab-made chemicals, we're still reaching for the same thing. Whether through tea therapy, psilocybin retreats, meditation, or just staring at the stars with a glass of something in hand, we're still trying to shift the gears of our minds and bodies. to see differently, to feel differently, to live differently, if only for a moment. So next time you sip something herbal, breathe in something earthy, or let your mind wander just a little further than usual. Remember the monks, the crones, the dancers, the honey-trapped soldiers, and the rye bread that laughed at your expectations. The Middle Ages were not a dull gray void between empires. They were full of color, chaos, fear, and wonder. And the people, they weren't just surviving, they were exploring. One sip, one puff, one vision at a time. Thanks for sticking with me through this trip into the medieval mind. Now go make some tea. Just maybe skip the nightshade.